Hey everybody, I'm Michael White, and this is my podcast, The Bible Lonely. I'm a studying theologian, Second Temple Jewish literature junkie, and a big fan of foreign concepts that force me to read the Bible like never before. And on this podcast, I hope to help lead you after me in finding out more about all these foreign concepts. So, whether you're a layman Bible fan or scholar and theology freak, this podcast is just for you. I've even read other religious texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pseudepigrapha, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, and more, and you can find all my notes and thoughts on those items on my website with the link in the show notes or by searching thebibleonian.com. With all that said, let's Bible on. How do we read the different genres of the Bible? Why even is there poetry in the first place? Why is there poetic retellings of things that already happened in a narrative just before it? Why does any of this even matter? Well, we will be exploring just the response to those questions in this episode of The Bible Lonely. So the Bible Project actually has a really good playlist on how to read the Bible as a whole, plot, characters, setting, all the different genres. And actually their work on how to read the different genres has been pretty helpful for this episode of the podcast, as well as Robert Alter's Art of Biblical Narrative and Art of Biblical Poetry. And I don't recommend those books as good sources for finding out where the Torah or the Hebrew Bible came from, because I differ on that. But as reading the Bible as literature, I love those books. I think they're fantastic, as do many other, even conservative scholars. And anyways, getting back to the Bible Project, in one of their videos, this is what they say, and I think it's really helpful for a preface to this episode on the different literary genres of the Bible. They say, think of it, that is reading the Bible, like walking into a bookstore, where every aisle has a different kind of literature. There's history or poetry or nonfiction, and when you choose an aisle and pick up a book, you're going to have a different expectation. Things differ that you're looking for. And if you don't pay attention to what style it's written in, you will miss out on the brilliance of each book. And I'll add in, you'll miss out on the entire point of the book, and you won't even know how to read the book. So, for example, if you're reading nonfiction, then you're reading it for the story. Of course, you hope that the person who's writing the autobiography or whatever story is doing a good job at writing and keeping you in suspense and explaining things well, and that they're intellectual and they have a great vocabulary. But if you're reading a fictional book, for example, you're hoping it is not necessarily first, but you're hoping that it's scientifically accurate. You don't want a bunch of hobo-jobo, GB-weeby, especially if it's science fiction, something that's quite popular today. You're going to be paying attention to the structure, especially all the different important details, because if it's made up, then you're hoping that these authors are putting in time and effort into making a really high-quality crafted literature. And so in the same way, when reading the Bible itself, the word Bible means book. And so for that reason, I actually prefer the term the scriptures, because scriptures is plural, but it's one word. And so it helps you understand that it's unified, but it's a bunch of different little books that make it up. And so there are a bunch of different literary genres. And so why does that matter? Well, first, we need to look at contemporary literature and what are its conventions. Conventions being the way that it communicates. How does it talk to us? What are the different things that it tries to take advantage of the most? Well, at least in our society, some of the most important or mostly used conventions of literature, and again, it's going to depend from author to author, especially among different cultures, but especially here in the West and in the US, we live in a low context culture. So what does that mean? What even is a low context culture? Well, a low context culture, now low context versus high context, one is not better than the other. However, a low context culture just means that you do not need to have a lot of contextual understanding for the culture. That doesn't mean that we don't have a culture. It just means that when you come across media and literature, a lot of the times authors will explain the cultural items that people would not necessarily be familiar with, although if they're a part of the culture they would. They will explain that away. It's very high detailed. For example, when you come to a character in a book, it talks about how they have, for example, it may say they had long, red, flowing, wavy hair. They had green eyes and they had freckles. And it'll go into a lot of details. It's intentionally trying to be very clear. It tries to make sure you understand everything, how things happened, what happened, how characters are feeling, all of that. And so in that way, it has a liberal economy. And I use that word to mean that it's using a lot of words just to convey one idea, to go in depth on how we might want to know how things are happening. Now, I'd really like to have a better word, but for right now I don't. But it uses, it's very realistic. It wants you to believe that these stories scientifically happened. It tries its best to reproduce kind of what you might see if you're looking at video camera footage of the story, so that you can have very clear pictures and everything makes perfect sense. And again, it's apologetical and it's scientific. It's not always scientifically accurate. A lot of the times it's not. But it tries to be. And it tries to back itself up and prove that it's right and that it's doing everything okay. And that's how it tries to do. Now, when you get to biblical literature, it's almost the exact opposite. Very different. So instead of the low context, there's a high context culture. And the biblical authors, especially in the Old Testament, are just assuming that you're already picking up on all the different motifs of the ancient Near East, that you already know all the different words and all the ideas that are preloaded with those words, and everything that comes with whatever story or concept that they're trying to get across to you. And so that's why a lot of these ideas don't really come across very clearly to us. For example, ritual purity and cleanliness versus uncleanliness. Why are pigs or even these scaled fish, why are they unclean? Why does it have to be split at the hooves and not chew cud, or all these different things? Another thing is that it lacks detail. It lacks detail. It just intentionally does. Creation, the first account of creation is, in my opinion, one sentence. The second account is like a page. The third account is like a page. Very, very lacking on detail. You'd like to know what was the fruit of the tree of knowing good and bad. And you'd like to know why was it a serpent? Why is the serpent talking? How does that work? Again, that gets into another thing that I'm going to mention later. It's intentionally ambiguous. It's intentionally not giving away everything on the first read. It wants you to reread it because that's what it is. It's made to be hagad, or meditated on, or mumbled, as you read in Psalm 1. It is, for a very good reason, not giving away a lot of details. And for example, in contemporary literature, you'll read about how she had long, red, wavy hair, green eyes, freckles, a nice smile, a nice jawline, yada, 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 yada. When you get to the Bible, for example, one of the characters that's given quite a bit of detail is Edom, and that's relative to the rest of the Bible. Sorry, not Edom, Esau. And Esau is said to be red. And why does it say that he has red hair? Well, because when he goes to Jacob and asks for his stew, and he's going to sell his birthright for it, he says, "Give me some of that red." And he's said to be hairy. Why does it matter that he's hairy? Well, Jacob is going to lie by putting on goat skin. And Esau is actually going to talk like an animal. And if you're reading Robert Alter's translation, especially his comments on his translation, you'll pick this up, that Esau is being shown like an animal. And so all that red hair is just characterizing him as almost like an animal being. So then, again, remember from last episode, we talked about how All of these things are intentionally put this way. It's stylization. There's a spare economy instead of the liberal one. It's being very spare in what it gives you and the idea it gives away, which means when it does use something, when it does mention in detail, you want to pay attention to it to see how it's characterizing things and what it's saying. And again, all these conventions are just in general. It's stylized, as I just said, and it intentionally appears ambivalent. It seems like, oh, why are there two different creation accounts? Well, it's trying to give a contrast. The first one, Genesis chapter 1, is actually talking about a zoomed out picture of creation where God is making the waters, dry land, and humanity. And you don't even get any names for anybody. But then in the second creation account, it's really close and it's intimate. And so, ambivalence is like, it seems like it's saying two different things at the same time, two opposite things. And so the second one, female is created last. Why is she created last instead of them both being created at the same time? Well, it's because it is not good for man to be alone. Throughout the process of creation, man is given a job. He's given a role to name all the animals and see if any of them fit, but they don't. And so it's an intentional ambivalence. They were very purposeful in making it seem like to contrast these. In the first page, it's showing how they're equal and they are both images of the glory of God. But in the second one, it's showing how man needs woman and woman needs man. Man needs that ally, woman. And it's also zoomed in. It shows God breathing into the dust and forming humanity. And so all these things are very, very important for reading biblical literature. And so it's very important to just pay attention to when it's using these and how and why it has these. So for the next part, I just wanted to look at the different types of literary genres in the Bible. And again, in general, it's important to pay attention to repeated words and phrases and ideas and diction and wordplay, connotation, denotation, the structure of individual stories, poems, or ideas, as well as movements and texts. So what do I mean by that? Repeated words. Go, for example, throughout the Genesis chapter 1, and you'll see that 10 times it says that God said, God said, God said. Well, you actually have to add in Genesis, go all the way to Genesis 2:3. But 10 times he says that. Well, also, there's the 10 commandments in Exodus 20 and in the book of Deuteronomy. There's also the 10 plagues. So it started with 10 repeated words, God said, God said, God said. And then by the time you get to the 10 commandments, for example, it's not saying, and God said, I am the Lord your God. And God said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. And God said, and God said. But it's just saying all the 10 different ideas. And you're supposed to be able to connect those yourself and see the 10 commandments as a new 10 words that God is giving to make an order for a new creation that he's putting into place. Again, so it's a repetition of words, but not just words, but phrases and ideas. Even if the words aren't the same, sometimes synonyms are used. And later, since it's going to assume, again, it's a high context culture, it's going to assume that you've already got the idea of the word. And so it doesn't need to repeat the word, it'll just repeat the idea. You want to pay attention to diction. What words are used? It's very important. For example, in speech, if somebody who is related is to the king, comes up to the king and says, my king, then that's diction, that's word choice. They're choosing to call him the king because right now they feel they're trying to come to get a request from the king. They want to honor and respect him, and they're not trying to come to this on familial terms of, hey, I know you, you know me, I'm your son, we're connected in that way. But they're trying to place the king high above by noting that they're an authority and that they are the supreme sovereign of the country so that they can appeal to them. And so it's very important to see how people are referring to each other. And so, for example, Adam doesn't even name, Eve isn't even given a name until the end of Genesis chapter 3. And so when God comes to him in Genesis chapter 3 and says, where is that woman? Or no, I'm so sorry. God says, I was mixing up Adam and God, and God says, what have you done? And Adam says, well, he gets to it. He says, well, the woman that you gave me, she gave it to me and I ate. So why is he saying the woman that you gave to me? Well, he's blaming God. There's a very obvious reason for that diction. You want to think about connotation, right? What does it mean? What is the word's dictionary definition and denotation? How are people going to be taking that word? Because, for example, in the New Testament, all the different authors of the Bible are writing at the same time. And the apostles aren't necessarily seeing each other's writings, although there are references to the other writings and they're validating them. But they aren't necessarily using the same words in the same way. So you have to see how each apostle uses their different words. And then next, I want to look at actually stories, poems, ideas. As I mentioned last, we will actually be going pretty in depth on that. So, the three different categories or literary genres, as you may, for the Bible. And again, I'm getting a lot of this from Bible Project and their podcasts and videos on the different literary genres. They did a lot of research for this, so I'm really grateful for that. So the first that most of us imagine the Bible as being is narrative. And that's because it's a whopping 43% of the Bible. And it's just a plain written account of events. It's useful for passing on a straightforward account of events that challenges readers to ponder it. Again, that's straightforward as in relative to poetry. Because as you know, if you've read biblical poetry, especially the prophets, you know that that is quite challenging, especially when in comparison to just the narrative. It's calling you to pay attention to locations, to events, to dates, to times of year, and characters and dialogues. Again, especially when these are all repetitions of each other. And so some examples, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, Jonah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts and Revelation. Poetry actually makes a whopping 33% of the Bible. It's literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, poems collectively or as a genre of literature. It's useful for communicating stories, ideas, or emotions in a unique way that other forms of communication cannot communicate. And you need to pay attention to parallelism. And again, we'll be getting into this more in a little bit, especially on poetry. Parallelism, point of view, stanzas, which are like poetic paragraphs, so as to say. Intensification, how things are made more intense. Metaphors and similes. And something I just want to note real quick that's pretty interesting that was pointed out to me again by Robert Alter. Again, he has a book called The Art of Biblical Narrative, which has inspired a lot of this. And he has one called The Art of Biblical Poetry. And his on biblical poetry is pretty helpful because not only does it go over how to read poetry as a whole, but even goes through the prophets. And then for the wisdom, what's usually called the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Job. He goes over how those different books have their own poetry and how to read them. And so 33% of the Bible, again, that's a third of the Bible. That's a lot of it. And some examples are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And again, notice there are not any works that are wholly poetic in the New Testament. Lastly is prose discourse. And this makes up the remaining 24% of the Bible. It is written communication. It's useful for getting across ideas in a very straightforward fashion. And so you need to pay attention to relationships between sentences, fragments, and ideas, especially by following, the epistles are the most popular examples of this. But you'll look for therefore, so, if, but. All those different conjunctions are so important because they show you the flow of thought and of ideas in the passage. And so some examples of this are going to be Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st through 3rd John, and Jude. And now I lastly wanted to mention that no book, almost no book, is entirely one genre or the other. Most of the time, the books are actually, for the point of narrative, throughout the narrative, there's poetry. In fact, by the time you've made it to the end of the first page, you've already run into the poem. In Genesis 1:27. And God made man in the image of God. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That's a poem right there. Genesis 2. Man sings a poem about woman. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she came from man. All throughout narrative. And then even whenever you get to the epistles, there are some poems in there. Now, these are a little bit more disputed. Some people will say they are. Some people will say they aren't. Some translations will reflect poetry in places where others won't. And so for that, the more updated translations are going to show more poetry than the not as recent translations. And some might even show the whole Old Testament as being poetic and go line by line. And so, it's all just, it's not always binary. No book is just one or the other. So, with all that said, I do want to jump into poetry and the different ways that poetry works, because poetry is especially one of the harder genres. So when you get to poetry, a really big thing for Hebrew poetry, the poetry you'll find in the Hebrew Bible, is that it's not so much about rhyming words as it is rhyming ideas, so as to say. Or, as we use the one word to refer to it, parallelism. Now, parallelism is very important. Without it, you probably won't even scan these as being poetry at all. And so I just kind of want to show how parallelism works. There's different levels and structures, and more complex and more simple structures. And I kind of want to actually go through the more simple structures of poetry. So, you can see in Psalm 137, 5 through 6, what's called reverse symmetry. And now, if you hated school and English class and all this, why is the door red? Well, the red represents anger and all this. And especially if you hated poetry in school, well, then I'm sorry. You're probably going to hate me now. But there's reverse symmetry. And the nicer, cooler, more scholarly word for this, maybe, is chiasm. And a chiasm goes, and again, this is referring to rhyming, A, B, B, A. So, Psalm 137, 5 through 6. It begins with, if I forget you, Jerusalem, and then it ends with, if I don't remember you. So, in the first and in the last, it's pretty much saying, if I don't remember or if I forget you. Both of them have the ideas of forgetting that it's rhyming. And so, in the center, you have, let my right hand wither, and let my tongue stick to my palate. So you have the ideas of forgetting and not remembering Jerusalem in the first and the last. And in the middle, you have body parts that are going into disorder and not functioning. A right hand withering and a tongue sticking to my palate. Again, it's not always about using repeated words necessarily, but it's about ideas that makes it parallelistic. And so when you read it all together, you can get a better understanding of the beauty, the sophistication, and the structure of this verse. So altogether, if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate, if I don't remember you. And then there's also forward symmetry. Forward symmetry is going to be A, B, A, B. And so one example of this is in Psalm 33, verses 10 through 11. The A's say, the Lord frustrated the plans of the nations. And then the second one says, the Lord's plan endures forever. So you have the plans in both of them. So first of all, you just have the repeated the Lord. Then you have the plans. And while one is the opposite, that the Lord's plan endures forever, whereas the nations are frustrated by the Lord, the idea of the Lord and plans are repeated. And then in the different, the other repeated lines, parallelistic lines, it says, he reduced to nothing the schemes of the peoples, the schemes of his heart from generation to generation. Again, you have the word schemes that's repeated, and then in the first one, it's about the schemes of the people, and in the second one, generation to generation. And in the second half, it's talking about the Lord, and in the first half, it's talking about the people. So, altogether, again, A, B, A, B, it says, the Lord frustrated the plans of the nations. He reduces to nothing the schemes of the peoples. The Lord's plan endures forever, the schemes of his heart from generation to generation. And if you're reading that as just flat text, you're really taking away a lot from that. But if you read it as parallelistic poetry, you start to see the beauty and the sophistication in it. And you start to see how ideas are expressed in it. And so you can also see more complex reverse symmetry in Psalm 31, 23 through 24. It says, I'll go over this. The A's are love the Lord and be strong and let your heart take courage. The B's are all you his godly ones and all you who hope in the Lord. And then the C's are the Lord preserves the faithful and fully recompenses the proud. So this one is complex, but it's A, B, C, C, A, B. So love the Lord, all you his godly ones. The Lord preserves the faithful and fully recompenses the proud. Be strong, let your heart take courage, all you who hope in the Lord. So there are even more complex ones, especially as you start to look at whole passages. Lastly, I just wanted to look at how entire psalms can be, or not just psalms, but poems in general, have these bigger structures. So for example, Psalm 67 is a very perfect chiasm. In the beginning, it says, may God be gracious to us and bless us, and make his face shine upon us, Selah. And then in the last line, it says, may God bless us, that all the ends of the earth might fear him. So God's blessing us. That's great. And he's being gracious to us. In the second, and in the second to last, it says this. In the second, that your ways may be known in the land, your salvation among all nations. In the second to the last, then the land will yield all its harvest, and God our God will bless us. So these two are both obviously about the blessing going out to the land through that blessing, that salvation, and that grace. In the C's, the third and the third to last, the first of the C's goes like this. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. And the third to last says, may the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. And so that actually gives you a hint. If you didn't already know, you're reading the psalm straight through, and you see these two, and these are the only ones that are exactly matching. You can try to know, you already know that in one way or another, these other ones have to be matching, because those are just straight up matching. So you got to look for that. And then the D's, you have, may the nations be glad and sing for joy, and guide the nations of the land, Selah. And then E, right in the middle. Again, this is a chiasm for the whole psalm, the whole poem, not just one verse. For you rule the peoples with justice. And there's no matching one, because that's just the direct middle. And again, what is that doing? Well, for this one, for chiasm, it's obviously putting the stress on the very center, that God is ruling the people with justice. And then you get the ideas on the outside, that through that there's a blessing to the people, and that blessing goes out to the nations. And so it's a stylistic expression of the idea that God is just, and through that he blesses his people, and blesses his people to bring a blessing to all the people and all the lands. And because of that, we should raise up praise to God. And so you have that symmetry in verses in poems. You also have it in stanzas and in entire poems. And then you even have this type of symmetry in narratives, in just how it's told, not necessarily the parallelism in the way that poetry has it, but in the way that stories are told. Great example is Genesis 2:4 through 3:24. So in the first part, humanity is created and placed in the garden. That's 2:4 through 17. And in 3:22 through 24, humanity is banished from the garden. Obviously, it has to go with going in and going out. Those are parallel. In 2:18 through 25, man and woman are created and unified. In 3:14 through 21, there's the consequences for the snake, and man and women are divided. In C, dialogue between the snake, there's a dialogue between the snake and the woman. And in the second C, 3:18 through 13, there's dialogue between God and the humans. And then D, right in the middle, you have the failure. 3:6 through 7, the woman and the man eat from the forbidden tree. The point, it's emphasized on the tip. Think of it like a knife that's equal on both sides. The point is the tip. You have these parallels, both sides are symmetrical. And so what is the point of it? The point is the literal point, the tip. That's the sharp part that's going to hurt you and that's going to attack you. And that is the force of it. That's the force of poetry, especially chiasm. The point is the tip, is that the man and the woman eat from the forbidden tree and that humans have failed. And so actually the whole Bible is like this. Well, first let me show you symmetry like this in an entire book. In case you couldn't see this coming already, the book of Esther is just a perfect picture of this. And again, this is a chiasm, but there's also the other different types of symmetries that you can find in entire books and in places. Whether that's a reverse symmetry, forward symmetry, or complex reverse symmetry, or some other type of more complicated ones. But I'm showing you the easier ones so that when you go ahead and read the Bible for yourself, that you can see those and understand them and know what the Bible is trying to do. So in the book of Esther, for example, in chapters 1 through 2, that's the A, you see that the king of Persia's greatness. And in 9 through 10, you see Mordecai's greatness. In the first part of 3a, you see Haman elevated. In 8c, in the last part of 8, you see Mordecai elevated. In the second part of the third chapter, you see Haman's decree to kill the Jews. And in the second part of the 8th chapter, you see Mordecai's decree to save the Jews. In the 4th chapter, you see Esther and Mordecai plan to reverse the decree. And in the first part of 8, Esther and Mordecai plan to reverse the decree. In chapter 5, Esther has her first banquet. In 6, the whole story pivots. And in 7, Esther has her second banquet. And so the point is how it turns, where it pivots in Esther going to save the Jews from this awful person, Mordecai. And so going back to the Bible is about creation, humanity's failure, and then Jesus's rescue and redemption, which is again proof that the Bible is a unified story revolving around Jesus. And then so you have creation, failure, Jesus, rescue, and then you have new creation. And that is what the Bible is all about. And that is a brief overview of the literary genres of the Bible. I hope that you got away a lot from this, that this transforms how you read poetry, narrative, all these different parts of the Bible. And I hope to have you hear from me again in the next episode of the Bible Learner. Thank you.